4, I think, number 4.
Senator Munson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is an inquiry on the abuses, human rights abuses in Hong Kong. And it's my first opportunity to speak about this inquiry, which I'm hoping that a number of senators will have the opportunity to talk about this to build up a support for the people of Hong Kong. But I would like to start by acknowledging the suffering of all persons affected by the coronavirus in this country, in China, and around the world. And my sympathies and prayers are with you and your families. Honourable Senators, I'm lucky enough to have the freedom and a choice to speak in this chamber on my inquiry. I can speak today without fear, no fear of retribution, punishment, or retaliation for expressing my thoughts or the facts. These are everyday fears for people in Hong Kong. These are everyday fears for people in Hong Kong. Students and professionals, parents and children, sisters and brothers suffer from abuses of human rights and democratic freedoms in Hong Kong daily. Now, in 1988, I was in Hong Kong for a very happy reason, the birth of my son, Claude Mathieu, while I was CTV's bureau chief in Beijing. At that time, people were living in trepidation. People were leaving Hong Kong, but people really wanted to stay because Hong Kong was their home. But people were leaving, and it wasn't a trickle, in anticipation of its handover to China from the United Kingdom. They fled due to fears of losing human rights and the rule of law. This emigration was further fueled by what I witnessed. I witnessed a year later, and I don't need to go into the details, but it is and was the massacre at Tiananmen Square. I have seen what abuses a government will inflict on its innocent citizens, what they do when they don't fall in line. When they fight for the democratic freedoms each of us in this chamber enjoy every day. As we know, in 1977, the territory was handed over with a guarantee of Hong Kong's separate political and economic systems than those of mainland China, under the one country, two systems principle. And for a while, it really seemed it was working. Fast forward to June 2019, and history is repeating itself. Pro-democratic protest started due to serious, long-term, and ongoing transgressions to freedoms of religion, speech, democratic rights in Hong Kong, including the introduction of the extradition bill proposed by Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam in February, just a year ago, 2019. The bill would have allowed extraditions to mainland China and was viewed as an intentional view by Beijing to erode freedoms. Finally, it was formally withdrawn 8 months later in September, but the damage was done. Too many people had been arrested for their public opposition to the bill and had suffered at the hands of police brutality over the months of protest. So the protesters continued their demands, and their demands are quite straightforward, and you've heard them. They bear repeating here. Democratic reforms and universal suffrage, an independent inquiry into police brutality, and amnesty for protest-related offenses. Senators, these are simple, reasonable, and fair demands. They are so commonplace for us that we barely give them a second thought. Our biggest barriers to election access in this country is either voter apathy or bad weather. So while this is a reminder to be grateful for what we have, it is also a call to action for us to support these rights around the world. According to Hong Kong Watch, and it's based in the UK, more than 7,000 protesters have been arrested since last June. Of those, almost 1,100 have had their cases brought to court and been charged. About 550 have been charged with rioting, with only 12 sentenced. The sentencing for rioting can be up to 10 years in prison. 10 years. It is estimated that 40% of the arrested protesters are secondary and university students. And we know, you've seen the pictures, children have been arrested too. The youngest person convicted in the protests so far is 12 years old. While protests can often lead to vandalism and violence by a minority of those present, There is no excuse for the extreme police brutality that is taking place. The excessive violence by Hong Kong police force has led to a collapse of trust. The majority of the Hong Kong public support the protesters. In fact, 1 million, or roughly 15% of its population, joined in the New Year's Day rally in support of the demands I mentioned earlier. I will remind you that these demands are as simple as democratic freedoms and the right to fair votes, as well as an inquiry into police brutality. It has been reported, honourable senators, that during crowd control responses, the police have shot rubber bullets into the faces of protesters and used thousands of rounds of tear gas and excessive force. Scenes of people, even children, being severely beaten with batons and fists during arrest. Once in detention, there have been reports of denied access to medical attention and legal counsel, as well as reports of torture, sexual violence, and unlawful strip searches. Amnesty International is demanding a prompt and independent investigation into the violations, and Amnesty said this in September. The evidence leaves little room for doubt. In an apparent thirst for retaliation, Hong Kong security forces have engaged in a disturbing pattern of reckless and unlawful tactics against people during the protest. This has included arbitrary arrests and retaliatory violence against arrested persons in custody, some of which have amounted to torture. Now, additionally, in more than 85% of cases investigated by Amnesty International, the arrested person was hospitalized as a result of their beating by police. Honourable Senators, this comes close to home for me, and it should come close to home for you, because you probably have been visited by those who walk the streets of Hong Kong and have participated in these protests. But, sadly for me, I know one of the men who is now in jail, Edward Leong. I want you to remember this name. I met Edward in June 2017 in my Centre Block office here on Parliament Hill. And he was charismatic. He well-spoken, soft-spoken, but a kind person. Suit on. Just looked like most of us. He talked about how much he treasured the Canadian values of human rights, equality, democracy, and multiculturalism. He expressed his gratitude and honor of meeting our Canadian veterans a few years ago in a Battle of Hong Kong commemoration ceremony. And it moved him, and it moved me when he talked about it. I had an uncle who served in that part of the world in the Second World War. As is often the case, and he wanted to have that done, we took a photo together for Twitter and promised to keep working towards our common goals. Edward returned to Hong Kong and continued to be widely supported for his democratic leadership and commitment to rights and freedoms. Edward Leong, as I said, is now in jail. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison in 2018 for his participation in the demonstration and for his public support of democracy and independence. Senators, I was updated on Edward's well-being just yesterday, and I was extremely upset to learn that earlier this month he was moved to a Category A maximum security prison, which are reserved for the most dangerous of offenders. This is no place for a nonviolent, pro-democratic activist. Edward's life story, political work, and his involvement in the Hong Kong protest in 2016 are detailed in the documentary Lost in the Fumes. Time magazine noted the film should be essential viewing for participants of the most recent protest. And they recognized Edward on their list of 100 next rising stars expected to shape the future. As the situation in Hong Kong continues, I often think of Edward and his family, and I send them strength and support from the Senate of Canada, and I hope you do too, and I hope you send strength and support to all of those who are behind bars in Hong Kong. They don't deserve to be there. Hong Kong is part of the fabric of this country, 500,000 of whom live here and now. They are Canada as Canada is Canada, and we can never, ever forget that. Colleagues, it is not only Hong Kong citizens who are being censored and abused. Press freedoms, something I'm familiar with after being thrown in jail a few times in China doing my work there. Press freedoms are also being denied. Many journalists are reported being harassed and intimidated by the Hong Kong police force because of their coverage or attempts to cover the protest. Tear gas and rubber bullets have been aimed at journalists. The police have obstructed videos and pictures by shining lights into cameras. This even though journalists are easily identifiable with yellow vests, helmets, and press identification visible. The harassment doesn't ever seem to stop because now there's sort of a form of self-censorship in bookstores and different places in Hong Kong, and you're in trouble if you have printed or are trying to publish or you're trying to sell a book that has anything critique of the mainland China government or the government in China. Now, as you know, 3 journalists from the Wall Street Journal were expelled from Beijing in February for an opinion piece that they published. And now it's being reported that appropriate visa renewals are becoming difficult to obtain for foreign correspondents. Honourable Senators, again, history is repeating itself. We cannot sit back and watch this happen. Journalism plays a crucial role around the world. When journalists face censorship and barriers to reporting their stories anywhere, it is a threat to press freedoms everywhere. The last governor of Hong Kong, Lord Chris Patten, said at a lecture just last month, quote, "Around the world, liberal democracies have to stand up for themselves if their system of governance and the rule of law are to survive as the heartbeat of international politics in the century ahead." What a struggle there is in Hong Kong, a struggle in which we all have a vital stake. What happens there will affect us all. Depend on it. The defense of Hong Kong's values by its brave citizens is our cause too. The words of Chris Patten. It seems like the protests have been less active in the last few months, but that is only because of efforts to contain the coronavirus. Like here, this virus has created public concerns and reclusion. The people of Hong Kong want the world to know. The people of Hong Kong want the world to know they are not backing down. They still fear police retaliation and daily threats to free speech and democracy. They fear that China is abandoning the one country, two systems principle. We're not even halfway there to the 50 years. I think we're just around halfway. They want you to know they still need our attention. As policymakers, we need to use our positions and influence to help people who are suffering. As such, a Parliamentary Friends of Hong Kong group will be formed in the coming weeks, and I encourage senators with a like-mindedness for human rights to join. I also invite you to participate in this inquiry and to support Senator Hosakis' motion to have the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee examine and report on the situation and to speak out on social media about the human rights violations and abuses happening in that great and wonderful place of Hong Kong. Hong Kong, my son's home. Finally, I want to thank all the people across the world who are using their voices to support democratic rights and to stand up for press freedoms. We hear you and we support you. Thank you, Honourable Senators.